CBS News has projected what was largely expected. Donald Trump will win the caucuses, and what we want to look at now is by just how much and what that means for the remaining primary contests in the coming months. Meanwhile, Trump has already set his sights on the general election.
I'm the only one. Every single poll over the last 2 months, and beyond that mostly, but over the last 2 months, I'm beating him and beating him very substantially. I'm saying we're beating him because we have to get him out. He's destroying our country. He is totally destroying our country.
That, as we know, is not true. Donald Trump is beating Joe Biden, but not as handily as Nikki Haley in the latest set of polls. But anyway, Iowans made their choice Monday, and they say they made that choice based mostly on who shares their values and who fights for people like them. We have a team out in Des Moines, Iowa, including our chief Washington correspondent, Major Garrett, chief White House and political correspondent Ed O'Keefe, and chief election and campaign correspondent Robert Costa. I'm going to go around the horn quickly, gentlemen, and just get your take on wherever you want to put your finger on the results we have so far. Major, I'll start with you.
So here's the interesting thing, John, among many others. Former President Trump has now set a new standard in modern presidential campaigning. You can skip all the debates, barely come to the first contested state as compared to the others who are vying for votes, claim you are an incumbent, a challenger, and a victim. That is to say, an incumbent former president, a challenger going up against a sitting opposition party president, and a victim of what he argues and many Trump supporters regard as overzealous prosecutors in lots of different cases, civil and criminal. Put all that together, things that any other politician that you and I have covered through our many years, John, would have considered substantial self-inflicted wounds, either not showing up at debates, not going and campaigning and meeting the voters, or indictments as a huge wounding aspect, turn them all into advantages. Advantages that have transformed Trump, who some in the Republican Party thought it should move beyond after 2022, and not only a victor here, but a convincing one.
Bob Costa, your thoughts on what we know so far. We don't know about what the second place finishing order is going to look like, but we know it's going to be distant, at least based on results and projections. So what do you make of tonight, Bob?
Just talking politics first, John. This is the beginning of a march to the nomination for former President Donald Trump. You don't have this kind of showing in Iowa, the first contest inside the Republican Party, which has many evangelical conservative Christians like those who populate the electorate here for the GOP and not have a real shot at the nomination. So he's coming out of the gate fast politically. He's consolidating his coalition, reviving it. But when you step back, there's another element at play here. As Major said, this is not any type of normal candidate. A former incumbent running for another term after being out of office, highly unusual in American history, and just years after there was an insurrection at the U.S. Capitol following repeated attempts by Trump to overturn the 2020 election, an attempt that failed but came close to pressuring the vice president at the time, Mike Pence, to come to the brink of denying that certification. So you cannot separate the politics from the issues of democracy here. They're interlocked with what's going on with the Trump campaign, as well as what's happening in the courtroom. Trump facing myriad legal challenges as well.
Ed, your take.
I would resist using Iowa to describe what the rest of this will look like. Obviously, he continues to have dominance over his party. He's going to set records tonight in terms of the likely win. But look at what our entrance poll shows us here in Iowa, the most important candidate quality. About 4 in 10 say they were looking for someone who shares their values. Roughly a third saying they're looking for someone who fights for people like me. But look at those last two numbers there. Can defeat Joe Biden and has the right temperament. We've all spent time in the Northeast and in New England where this race is headed next. Those two numbers are going to end up ranking higher in New Hampshire primary exit polls than they do here in the Midwest, in a state that has become decidedly more conservative and certainly pro-Trump. And if you look at those who tonight voted for someone like Nikki Haley, maybe we're thinking about Ron DeSantis, they're worried about winning. They're not worried about purity tests. The overwhelming number of Republican caucus goers tonight seem to have been more interested in allegiance in conservative purity or Trump purity than in actually winning a general election. And I think that will change considerably in New England. Let's remember, the Republican Party lost statewide elections across New England, lost Senate seats, governorships, House seats, and Nikki Haley can go into that state and say, do you remember when you had Republican members of Congress? Do you remember when Massachusetts had a Republican governor? When Maine had a Republican governor? When you had a Republican senator? They will. Yeah. And they're going to remember that the only way the Republican Party wins in their neck of the woods is Republicans more like Haley winning than Donald Trump. So we'll see. And let's also remember, Iowa and New Hampshire don't normally align in this decision. And if Haley and DeSantis remain as close as they appear right now in these early hours and just a few percentage points worth of results, both of them have justification for continuing on. The question will be for how much longer. DeSantis plans to go first tomorrow to South Carolina, then to New Hampshire, signaling, I'd like 6 more weeks at least of this until we get here to the Palmetto State. And Haley obviously going to New Hampshire, hoping that she can grab Chris Christie's support and get ahead of the former president.
Of the 14% who said beating Joe Biden is something they cared about, the bare majority went for Trump. But your point, of course, Ed, is that those who sort that question in Iowa sort it much differently than the voters do. Than they do in New Hampshire. Major, back to you on this. One of the interesting findings in the entrance poll, 63% of Republican caucus goers said they believe Trump would still be fit to be president if he were convicted of a crime. What do you make of that number and his future court issues?
It speaks to a dynamic here that really ended the campaigns prematurely of two people who came to Iowa thinking that they had a chance, a real chance. Former Vice President Mike Pence and current South Carolina Republican Senator Tim Scott both came to Iowa thinking that they could be not only someone who could speak to and speak credibly to the evangelical vote here in Iowa, anywhere from 60 to 63% of caucus turnout based on historic standards, but they couldn't. And the reason they couldn't, and both campaign leaders have told me this, is because of the rallying effect that the indictments had around former President Trump. And those candidacies who came here strong with pedigrees and financing both got out of the race because they just saw in their own focus groups and their own internal polling that there was no way to climb that mountain. And that rallying effect was more than they could take care of, more than they could even begin to address. And they dropped out before a single caucus was held, weeks before that. And that's a dynamic that they say exists in Iowa. It may not exist in New Hampshire. It will probably exist to some visible extent in South Carolina. But it was their feeling, that is to say the Tim Scott and the Mike Pence campaigns, that it was strong in Iowa and probably strong elsewhere, and that gave them no credible path. So they got out way early.
Another point on the Mike Pence front that struck me is that in the entrance polls, when voters were asked which one of the 4 issues mattered most to you, abortion was 4th, tied with foreign policy. In terms of a concern for voters, Mike Pence had tried to find wedge room in there. It just seems like there weren't enough voters who cared about that issue. Sure. Bob, on this point that I just asked Major about the court, it felt like Donald Trump turned the courtrooms into the 100th Iowa county. There are 99 Iowa counties. He was in the courtroom campaigning. Do you see a connection between that and this candidate qualities in the entrance poll? The number 1 was shares my values, but number 2 was fights for people like me. Do you see a direct line between Trump's overwhelming support among those voters who say he fights for people like me and his visible appearance in all those courtrooms?
Yes, and Trump has said to me in recent days that he believes the courtroom is akin to the campaign trail. And I would just like to build, John, for a moment on the reporting offered by Ed O'Keefe and Major Garrett, their expert analysis. In the last few days here, I've been covering Trump voters, covering the final Trump rally here in Iowa. And just to give you a sense of how unusual this campaign is, at Trump's final rally, before he came on stage, his campaign played a video that said, God made Trump. And it spoke about Trump in reverential terms, religious terms, and spoke about Trump as some sort of divine figure who has come to the United States and the Republican Party to save it. And this was a dramatic video played before Trump took the stage. And so when you talk about Senator Tim Scott or former Vice President Mike Pence, These are Republicans just like Florida Governor Ron DeSantis, who came into Iowa seeking to get that evangelical voter, believing they can turn that voter away from Trump, offer a new generation, offer an alternative. But what I'm witnessing here in Iowa and across the country is many Republican voters, evangelical Christians, conservative Republicans, are saying, no thanks, we don't want an alternative. We believe Trump is a figure unlike any we've seen in American politics before. He is not only going to be our standard bearer, but our hero, and maybe even something greater in their view. Those are the terms in which Trump is being spoken about by his most fervent supporters in Iowa.
Ed O'Keefe, at the moment we have 39% is in, or 38% is in, and Haley and DeSantis are at about 20%. If it maintains at that level, isn't that the best of all worlds for Donald Trump? He wins big, and then there is no second person. It's not a two-person race. It's still a muddle among whoever is the not Donald Trump, which will bounce along with Trump still doing well and the opposition to him splitting the vote.
No, it's exactly what they want. Yep. They get over 50%. They leave the rest of them dueling amongst themselves yet again in another key state, and he continues to succeed. We've had people on earlier tonight who say, you've got to get this down to just one other person who can consolidate the not Trump, or preferably somebody other than him, side of the Republican Party together to prosecute the case against him in the states yet to come. Places like Michigan that have far more competitive general election races, the Carolinas and other big ones out in the South and the Midwest. And you know, the toiling that will go on between the Haley and DeSantis camps tonight about where they did better, how they did better, whether they should continue, will persist. And it's part of the reason why, and we've made this point earlier tonight, watch what the various camps decide to do about upcoming invitations to debate. Yeah. Does Nikki Haley say, no, I don't want to waste my time with the Florida governor anymore. I'm not showing up unless Donald Trump does. Does DeSantis show up and debate an empty lectern? Yeah. Does that help him in New Hampshire? We'll wait and see.
Final question quickly to you, Major. 65% of the entrance poll participants believe that Joe Biden was not the legitimate president. 31% believe he is. 90% or so of Trump supporters believe Joe Biden is not the legitimate president. I was struck by something I read Chuck Grassley, the 7-term senator from Iowa, say not long after January 6, 2021. He said Donald Trump cannot be the leader of the party anymore. Joni Ernst, the other senator from Iowa, was horrified by the acts of the 6th of January. They got the party, and Iowans in particular, wrong. Donald Trump knows where the Iowans are, and they're not disturbed about January 6th. They, in fact, believe he was just in his challenges of the election, which we know was not stolen from him, but rightfully went to Joe Biden.
It rightfully went to Joe Biden. It is the most scrutinized presidential election in American history. It has been tested in court over and over and over again. And former President Trump talks in very sort of broad generalizations about what happened, but never has he succeeded when any accusation of fraud or numerically significant fraud was tested in court. Not once, and not even close. And some of the harshest denunciations of supposed evidence presented by the Trump campaign was denounced most aggressively by Trump-appointed federal judges. But that doesn't matter, John. What this has become, your attitudes as a Republican and as a Trump supporter about the 2020 election, is, to borrow a phrase that Ed used a moment ago, about loyalty. It's a placeholder for just how ardent a Trump supporter you are. It's one of the ways you prove your legitimacy, your stature as a Trump supporter, and that's what it's become. It's completely divorced from underlying facts. It is, however, a sort of badge of your Trumpism.
Major Garrett, Ed O'Keefe and Robert Costa, I'm very grateful to all three of you all. Thank you very much.